I just noticed this looks kind of weird on a green screen because it's got the green and anyway, whatever. This is the RTX 3080 12 gigabyte version. The specific cooler model, you see the 12G there, anyway, is the Gigabyte Eagle, so not one of the highest end cooler models or anything like that. And we're putting it up against the Radeon RX 6800 XT. The specific model I have is the Tough Gaming OC, I think it's called. Anyway, I run them at their out-of-the-box settings, but I specifically wanted to mention that we're doing the 12 gigabyte version of the 3080 because that's the one that I have. I know in the comment section they're gonna be like, you're trying to make NVIDIA look better because it's the one I have. I don't have a 10 gigabyte model. I bought these during the GPU apocalypse when my channel was making less money and I wasn't getting sent review samples. So these are the ones I have. But I did want to update my 6800 XT versus 3080 because frankly the technologies have changed. There's been driver updates and new games have come out. A lot of people, thinking about running these at 4K based on older results. Well, we got some demanding new games. We want to look at Unreal Engine 5. We want to look at other not supporting old console generation games, things like that. Anyway, let's hop into the benchmarks. I'll give you some final thoughts at the end, but keep in mind that the 10 gigabyte version of the 3080 will be a few percent slower because not only does it have less VRAM, has a few less CUDA cores and memory bandwidth, so subtract a few percent off the 12 gigabyte results if you want to compare to a 10 gigabyte. And this is not some big conspiracy theory to make NVIDIA look better than AMD in this video. Anyway, let's just jump into the benchmarks. All right, we're starting out with Unreal Engine 5. Yes, it's Fortnite because Epic develops both Fortnite and Unreal Engine 5. So this is currently the only game available to test out the new Unreal Engine 5 features like Lumen, which is a software-based ray-traced lighting system. It has a hardware-accelerated version that is currently turned off. That's what it means when I say hardware RT off down below, but everything else is maxed out here. This also includes Nanite, which allows these trees to stream in smoothly without the level of detail popping in that you would get in Unreal Engine 4, that kind of thing, or if you turned Nanite off. Anyway, it looks good. I know this is a cartoony style game, but the lighting and everything looks very good. But this is very demanding. Both GPUs are below 60 FPS right now. The 3080 12 gigabyte currently has a 7% lead average, but notice the 6800 XT actually has a small lead in the 1% lows. And do keep an eye on those stats up top. Since both of these were below 60 FPS, I decided turning down to the high settings, and we're still leaving the hardware accelerated ray tracing off. So it still has Lumen software-based ray tracing. And I actually thought it was really interesting that by going down to the high settings, the GPUs are basically tied now with the 6800 XT actually with a small 1% lead, but the lead in the 1% lows is a 33% lead. If you look at the frame rate counters I'm running, the one on the left is the instantaneous frame rate, the one in the middle is the average frame rate that accumulates over the benchmark run, and the one on the right is the 1% lows. And if you're one of the people in the comments who is like, this has to be fake, how do you get Fortnite runs to be identical? It's a multiplayer game. I'm using the replay feature. You can see that in the middle there, the replay controls. Anyway, whatever. Now, this does have hardware accelerated version of the ray tracing available, so I've turned that on now. And here's where we're seeing the bigger lead for the 3080, as we would expect, where the hardware accelerated ray tracing cores on the NVIDIA GPU takes over. And now we see a 17% lead. However, both GPUs are below 60 FPS, which is not ideal. And the 1% lows are closer to a tie, although the 3080 12 gigabyte might have a slight lead there. So that is another thing to keep in mind. Now, if we want to use all of the settings maxed out, so we're keeping the hardware accelerated ray tracing, we're keeping the Epic settings on the Lumen and Nanite and all of that, we're gonna need to upscale. Now, a lot of engines would have FSR or DLSS. This game has been updated to include DLSS now, but when I filmed these benchmark runs back at the end of December, it didn't, but it did have TSR upscaling, temporal super resolution, which is similar to FSR and DLSS, but it's the one built into the Unreal Engine 5. So this is rendering below 1440p, but it does boost their performance significantly, well over 70 FPS now, although the 3080 still had an 11% lead, and I think that's mostly due to having the ray tracing enabled still, although it did drop over what it had at the native resolution. Now, going to 4K settings, I didn't even try out Epic with RT. I just went to high settings first, but you can see that both GPUs are in the 40 FPS range, although the 3080 12 gigabyte is certainly outperforming the 6800 XT here with a 12% lead overall, although the 1% lows are closer to a tie and maybe even a slight lead for the 6800 XT. And this is expected results. The Ampere generation of NVIDIA GPUs did scale better at higher resolutions relative to lower resolutions. And we're actually seeing that right here, where when we turn on TSR upscaling at the quality setting, so this is actually rendering the game at 1440p and then using temporal data and things like that to reconstruct an image that looks very close to 4K, although you will find some imperfections, especially in movement and things like that. But now both GPUs are giving good performance. They're in the mid-70s, and it's also a tie. So again, because this is actually rendering at 1440p, the 6800 XT is, catching up to relative to what we saw at the, at the actual native 4K resolution. So just an interesting thing about the architectures. Now, when we drop down to 1080p, we again see it as basically a tie, although the 3080 12GB does have a very small lead here in the average frame rates. Again, I'm going to point you to the 1% lows. The 6800 XT has over 60 FPS in the 1% lows, whereas the 3080 12GB only has about 51, 52 FPS in the 1% lows. And if you look at the frame time graphs, you can see that it's a much flatter, smoother frame time graph for AMD here relative to NVIDIA. And by the way, when you're judging the smoothness of a video that's recorded at 60 FPS, but the game isn't playing at 60 FPS, please don't judge it by what the footage looks like in your video. Go by the frame time graph. And once again, turning hardware ray tracing on gets the 3080 a larger lead, so now it has a 12% lead at 1080p, so this is totally maxed out 1080p settings. But once again, we get a smoother frame time graph with better 1% lows from the 6800 XT. And this is just something I've been seeing in Unreal Engine 5 on all of my GPUs. AMD seems to give me better 1% lows, at least in this game. This is the one we have to go off of. And you can see how demanding it can be with neither of these just like, they're both doing okay at 1080p, but they're not like knocking out of the park at max settings. Anyway, let's go to a different next-generation title. So A Plague Tale Requiem uses an in-house engine rather than the popular Unreal Engine. So this is one they developed themselves, but this is a game that's not worried about cross-compatibility with older consoles. This pushes the PS5 and the Xbox Series X to their limits. And at 1440p Ultra, it's pretty challenging for GPUs, although both GPUs here were averaging over 80 FPS in the benchmark run. As we get out into actual gameplay, they drop more into the mid-60s with the 3080 12GB with a 5% lead over the 6800 XT. And again, this is more typical of actual gameplay, and there's parts that are more demanding than this. So this is pretty demanding, but they're both going to give you a pretty good experience maxed out at 1440p. If you drop down to 1080p, again at the Ultra settings, the 3080 12GB now has a 4% lead, and both GPUs are giving you over 90 FPS a lot of the time. Certainly will drop down into the 80s, maybe even the 70s in the most demanding scenes of the game. But they're going to do a very good job at 1080p. These GPUs are still, I think, best targeted as 1440p GPUs, but as they get older, could be considered for really nice 1080p results as well. If we go up to 4K Ultra settings, the 3080 lead increases to 8%, and both GPUs are down into the 30 FPS range once we actually get into actual gameplay here, 36 versus 39, with the averages at 40 versus 44. So both GPUs could need some assistance at 4K. They're not maxing out the most demanding games at 4K. We saw that in Unreal Engine 5 with Fortnite. It couldn't max it out without some help. We're seeing that here in Plague Tale Requiem. Now, this game has DLSS, but it does not have FSR. It has some kind of resolution scaler with names that are sort of like what we get from DLSS and FSR, but I don't think they're actually using the same internal resolution. So I just used a couple of different options for the 6800 XT to hit over 60 FPS average, either going down to medium settings and using the res scaling at quality, or keeping it ultra settings but going down to performance. Whereas the 3080 12GB, if I left it at 4K Ultra and went to DLSS quality, it was close to 60 FPS. Anyway, those weren't really like-to-like comparisons, so let's move on. If you're into Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 or Warzone 2, which uses the same engine, then you're probably playing at reduced graphics settings because these are competitive. So this is 1440p, but I reduced the settings down to balanced. And you're reading that correctly. The 6800 XT has a 28% lead through this benchmark run. And that's actually expected results if you've seen how this game performs on AMD versus NVIDIA GPUs. In general, AMD GPUs overperform in this game relative to NVIDIA, or you could think of it as NVIDIA underperforming. Whatever the reason is, this game tends to deliver atypical results where AMD GPUs are giving a better than expected result relative to their NVIDIA counterparts compared to most other games that we test. So 28% lead there for the 6800 XT. Dropping down to 1080p balanced settings, the AMD GPU still has a 27% lead, so pretty similar scaling. Now, you might be like, really, 1080p? What's with all the 1080p testing? Well, this is a game where I think 1080p absolutely makes sense. People who are really into competitive gaming will often have a extremely high refresh rate but lower resolution monitor. There's a lot of people with a 240 hertz 1080p monitor with GPUs like this or better. Or even going up to a 360 hertz monitor. There's even some 500 hertz 1080p monitors out there targeting this esports demographic where you have a high-end PC and you want all of the frames for that competitive advantage. So again, that's why I'm going 1080p balanced settings rather than using the extreme preset. I'm trying to use more of what people might actually use when playing a competitive game like this. Now, Warzone will have similar results, although it will be more CPU limited due to the Battle Royale. It's also harder to benchmark. Here, I'm just using the built-in benchmark of the game. Now, in order to see what happens if we stress the GPU as much as possible in this game, we're now looking at kind of unrealistic use case, but still interesting in a GPU comparison video, which is we're looking at 4K Extreme. Now, usually the NVIDIA GPU will increase its lead at 4K. Here, it's just decreasing how much it's losing by. With the 6800 XT with a 14% advantage at 4K Extreme settings. So this is as much as you can turn it up. 4K Extreme, AMD is definitely the better performer here. But, like I said, I don't think these GPUs would be probably being used like this in this game. Although it is nice to see a game where they can both perform well at 4K, because in our more demanding recent titles, that wasn't necessarily the case. Now, Unreal Engine 4 is still one of the most popular graphics engines out there. There's still some upcoming games that were still, in the Unreal Engine 4 pipeline rather than Unreal Engine 5, and tons of previous games were in Unreal Engine 4. The Callisto Protocol is one of the newest Unreal Engine 4 games and one of the most, graphically demanding but also best-looking Unreal Engine 4 games. Here at 1440p Ultra, we're seeing the 3080 with a 6% lead over the 6800 XT, and it is normal for NVIDIA GPUs to kind of overperform a little bit relative to AMD in Unreal Engine 4. So they're both doing well here, although certain scenes will kind of dip the frame rate a bit. The averages were pretty good. If we go up to 4K Ultra, the averages are actually okay, but we'll see scenes like this hallway are particularly demanding and the frame rates are actually dropping down to around 30. And we're actually seeing the 3080 12GB with only a 4% lead going through these settings. And again, it's just pretty demanding here. If you're wondering if the 3080 is running out of VRAM or something, though, if you look at the green mem1 thing, memory, it can show the allocation and the usage, which is what the first number and second number represent there. And we're nowhere near the 12GB VRAM limit here. So I don't think it's that. Again, they're just giving a pretty similar result with the 3080 12GB up by 4%. Dropping down to 1080p Ultra, we see the 3080 12GB winning by 6%. And again, both GPUs doing well here. The in this game, when you're looking at 1080p results, you do want to keep an eye on the GPU utilization to see if they dip significantly below 100%, which would indicate more of a CPU limit or something like that. Right here in this hallway, we dropped down to 93, 94% for a second on the 3080. 93, 94% here again, a little bit more. So do keep an eye on that especially at the lower resolutions, there can be a little more of a CPU limit, despite the fact that I have one of the fastest gaming CPUs on the market with the 7700X with fast DDR5 memory. Now, I'm bringing up the CPU limitation because when I kick on ray tracing in this game, 1440p max, you would expect the 3080 to have a higher lead. It only has a 4% lead here. What's going on? Watch the GPU utilization percentage on the 3080, and you'll see it frequently dipping down to the low 90s or even the 80-something% range, indicating it's not able to be fully utilized. This often indicates a CPU limitation. Can indicate other things, but that's what I think is going on here. Adding ray tracing increases the CPU workload as it calculates the BVH on the CPU rather than the GPU. So I think we were seeing some CPU limitations there. They didn't multi-thread it well enough, which is why it didn't fully utilize the CPU, but could still be a CPU limitation. Anyway, Cyberpunk 2077 is not one of the newest games. I was trying to test, this video is focusing on new games. Well, it's not super old, it's about 2 years old, and it's still one of the most demanding games out there. And it's also a game that has been updated frequently, increasing its ray tracing options, increasing its FSR options to now include FSR 2.1. It also has some fairly up-to-date, but not quite the newest versions of DLSS. And it's also just still a demanding game, so it's a good GPU comparison. So we're going to go ahead and use it. So Cyberpunk 2077, 1440p ultra settings, both of these GPUs are doing excellently. In a single player game, even in a first person shooter, averaging in the upper 80s, around 90 FPS, is great. It'll feel smooth. For me, that 90 FPS mark is kind of the magic number for first-person shooters, where it starts to feel really smooth and responsive. So both doing great here. 3% lead for the 3080, but that's not that big of a deal. However, if we go up to 4K, we do see the expected result, which is the 3080 slightly increases its lead to now be an 8% lead. But both GPUs are struggling. Notice I actually turned down to high settings, right? We could have used the ultra settings. I turned it down to high, and we're still not getting 60 FPS through this bar scene. In this bar scene, we're actually averaging in the 40 FPS range. It gets a little easier in some of the other parts of the game, and as we go out into the city here. But both of these GPUs could certainly use some help. Also, since this benchmark's a little bit long, we have a chance to talk about some of the other numbers you see up here. When you're looking at the temperatures, they're fairly similar, but keep in mind that the temperature you get depends a lot on the cooler model that you're using, not just 6800 XT versus 3080 or AMD versus NVIDIA. It really depends on the specific cooler model that you're getting. Also, the power draw, notice the 3080 is reporting significantly higher power usage than the 6800 XT. And, NVIDIA was on a not as good of a process node for their GPU dies for this generation. That improved with the latest generation. Anyway, what if we did want to play the game at 4K using these GPUs? Well, as we're seeing with a lot of the newest titles, you're gonna have to reduce settings and upscale, sometimes one, sometimes the other, sometimes both. Here we're seeing if we drop down to the high settings, it wasn't good enough to get a 60 FPS. But if we also turn on FSR2 and DLSS2 to the quality setting, both GPUs are now giving us really nice averages. You can definitely play the game like this. It looks pretty good. The 3080 has a 4% lead. Also keep in mind that FSR2 and DLSS2 do not have identical image quality. You may or may not be able to pick out some of the differences in the side-by-side comparison. They both look pretty good on the quality setting at 4K. There's certain pros and cons, and I've actually done a whole video exploring that in depth in Cyberpunk specifically, so you could look for my video on that. In general, at 4K quality, though, I think they both look pretty good and are very usable. Now, let's dive into some ray tracing. One reason I like to use Cyberpunk is it has a whole bunch of different ray tracing settings to dive into, from pretty light workloads to heavy workloads, shadows, lighting, reflections. So if you go to the ray tracing low preset, which is what this is, it's basically the ultra preset, but then adds in ray traced local shadows. Only local shadows, not sun shadows, none of the lighting, and none of the reflections. Both GPUs are averaging over 60 FPS here, although the 3080 is getting closer to an 80 FPS average, and it has a 16% lead in the overall results by the end of the benchmark run. Now, this is lining up pretty closely to the results we saw in Unreal Engine 5 with Fortnite. When I turned on the hardware accelerated ray tracing, if I'm remembering correctly, it was something like a 18% lead or something like that for the 3080. Here we're seeing a 16% lead. So we can see that, yes, NVIDIA GPU has an advantage in ray tracing, but what we're going to see next is that that advantage varies wildly based on the type and amount of ray tracing that the GPU is being asked to deliver. If we turn on the ray tracing medium preset, it keeps the local shadows, but it also adds in the sun shadows, and it sets the lighting system to use some ray tracing at a medium setting. It could go all the way up to a psycho setting, but it doesn't go that far at this preset. Here we're seeing the 3080 now have a 44% advantage. But wait, why are there three things showing up here? I wanted to show that the 6800 XT is actually still usable here. You just have to use FSR to upscale, whereas the 3080 doesn't necessarily have to. And also I wanted to show that the 6800 XT with FSR2 upscaling at the quality setting gets very similar performance to what the 3080 can deliver natively here. Now, obviously the 3080 could use DLSS quality to then boost the frame rates well over 60 FPS and have the clear lead. And when I'm doing the percentage calculation, I'm obviously doing it native versus native. But I thought this would be an interesting result. You can also see the FSR2 quality versus the native image quality, but keep in mind YouTube videos are compressed, so you won't really get to see what it would look like on your actual screen. Now here's where we really see NVIDIA taking a massive lead with the ray tracing. If we go to the ray tracing ultra preset, it keeps the ray trace local shadows, it keeps the sun shadows. Now it also turns on the reflections, and the lighting goes up to the ultra setting. It actually doesn't go up to the psycho setting. So you could actually push ray tracing just a little bit farther if you wanted to, manually. Here we're seeing the 3080 with a 68% lead over the 6800 XT. The 6800 XT is averaging in the 20 FPS range at native resolution. And the 3080 really isn't knocking out of the park either, with only, around a 40 FPS average. 1% low is only a little over 30, but it's certainly a big advantage over the 6800 XT. Now on the right-hand side, be careful, it's not apples to apples. I'm showing what would it take to go over 60 FPS. For the NVIDIA GPU, we just need to go to DLSS quality to average like 69, 70 FPS. The 6800 XT can get over 60 FPS average, but you have to use FSR2 at the performance setting, which looks significantly worse. It's much fuzzier, so keep that in mind. Now, I wanted to test out ray tracing reflections separately because this is one of the most impactful settings when it comes to both image quality, but also to the performance difference versus the NVIDIA and AMD GPU. The ray trace reflections here are very demanding and they don't seem to perform well on AMD. Just using the Ultra preset, but then adding in the ray trace reflections as the only ray tracing, we now see the 3080 with a 44% lead over the 6800 XT. I thought this was an interesting setting because the 3080 can actually use ray traced reflections and average over 60 FPS natively with no DLSS, so this is very usable. The 6800 XT would be playable in the mid-40s, but you'd probably want to turn on FSR2 quality to then average actually over 70 FPS, which is nice. But again, keep in mind that the NVIDIA GPU could use DLSS to boost frame rates even further. But anyway, we're seeing that the ray tracing performance varies wildly from 16% lead to over 60% lead for the NVIDIA GPU. And I also wanted to look at it at 1080p, just looking at the RT Ultra settings. But I also wanted to look at, because AMD was not doing well here at RT Ultra, the percentage difference is a 63% win for the 3080 at RT Ultra native, and it's averaging around 60 FPS, so it's usable. Since the 6800 XT wasn't doing well here, and I didn't want to do a whole nother benchmark run at 1080p, I thought I'd also throw in just what if you took the 6800 XT and turned on RT reflections. If you just use the RT reflections on the 6800 XT, you can actually get a really nice looking 1080p image and average well over 60 FPS. So really what I want to say is the ray tracing is usable on the 6800 XT at 1080p and 1440p, but you just have to be mindful of the settings. And if you just want to crank ray tracing settings, The NVIDIA GPU does a better job, but if you really crank it at 1440p and higher, you'll have to use upscaling. Let's jump to another game. This is Forza Horizon 5 at 4K extreme settings. And the 6800 XT is actually winning by 2%, even though it's a 4K result, which is interesting. However, what I actually wanted to bring up is when I tested this game several months ago, last year, the 6800 XT had a much larger lead here. Because it had smart access memory support, which is like resizable bar. So if you have a compatible motherboard and CPU, you can enable that. And in certain games like Forza Horizon 5, it significantly boosts performance. However, NVIDIA has finally whitelisted more games for resizable bar support, and I believe we're seeing that result here, which is why the 3080 is now almost able to tie the 6800 XT in this game, when this used to be a significant win for AMD. So NVIDIA's been updating that. Now, before we go, I did want to test out some other graphics APIs. This is a DX11 game. God of War is one of the best looking, most recent DX11 titles. And here we're seeing 1440p Ultra, both GPUs crushing it, knocking it out of the park, great frame rates. However, we are seeing the 3080 12GB with a lead here by 16%, and I didn't used to see that a few months ago. This is another game where I noticed that the 3080 12GB is overperforming compared to where it used to be. There's been some major driver updates from NVIDIA, and I think we're seeing that here, where NVIDIA is benefiting from some driver updates that they've had compared to where they were, last year when I compared them, where this was a more evenly performant game, I guess is how I'd put it. The 6800 XT and the 3080 were almost tied in this game, maybe a slight lead for the 3080, and now we're seeing a significant win. I also wanted to test out Vulkan before we go. So some games use Vulkan rather than DX12 or DX11. Red Dead Redemption 2 actually supports both DX12 and Vulkan. I set it to Vulkan because I wanted to test Red Dead Redemption 2. I also wanted to test Vulkan, so let's test Red Dead Redemption 2 using Vulkan. This is 1440p at favored quality max, meaning I took the preset slider, which slides between favored performance and favored quality, slid it all the way to the right for favored quality. Both GPUs doing a great job here. The 3080 12GB with about a 5% lead. So again, fairly typical result. And remember that the 3080 10GB is a bit slower. It doesn't just have less VRAM, so it's a bit slower. So in all of these results, realize if you're comparing to 3080 10GB, the results would be much closer, and this would more likely to be actually a tie. You're not seeing the 1% lows or averages. I went off the average reported by the benchmark run to remove the load screens from the results. So what did we learn from the updated 2023 benchmarks? Well, let's talk about overall performance. Obviously, we can talk about the ray tracing difference, but in rasterized performance, it's very similar. And once again, a reminder that the 3080 12GB is a few percent faster than the 3080 10GB. So if you're making that comparison, subtract a few percent off the 3080 results, and you now have mostly a tie. So do keep that in mind if you're comparing it to the 10GB. Anyway, how about just overall performance on either of these? Is it good for 1440p? I think both of these GPUs show that they are still great 1440p choices. And if you look at the more demanding new games, like our Unreal Engine 5 completely maxed out settings, Plague Tale Requiem, things like that, we saw that it's possible that completely maxing these out, especially with ray tracing enabled, but even just maxed out normal settings, 60 FPS at 1440p, close. We might dip a bit below. So it's possible that some of the newest games, you might have to tweak settings a little bit if you're shooting for higher refresh rates. But we also saw it's easy to tweak those settings a bit and get high refresh rates at 1440p. And we saw that many games are less demanding on that, and both of these GPUs offer a high refresh rate 1440p experience, even at maxed out settings, and again, easy to tweak a few settings down a bit and get a bunch more frames as well, or use a little bit of upscaling. Now, if you're planning on using these at 1080p, it's just, well, they do even better. And I think these would be, really overkill for 1080p, although not necessarily. If you want high refresh rates in upcoming titles over the next few years, that's what this video is focusing on, right? More of 2023 and beyond. Then, you could buy GPUs of this caliber for 1080p, and especially if you buy the 3080, you can max out ray tracing at 1080p, that kind of thing, and be good to go there. 6800 XT, usable ray tracing at 1080p, maybe not max it out, but without ray tracing, definitely high refresh rate experience, looks great. At 4K, I think my conclusion is these are usable GPUs at 4K, even in new demanding titles, Unreal Engine 5, Plague Tale Requiem, but you will have to reduce settings or upscale, or in the more demanding games, both. And if you're planning on using ray tracing at 4K, honestly, even the 3080 is not great for that, although in lighter ray tracing workloads or just using some of the ray tracing settings along with upscaling, again, you might be able to get some amount of ray tracing happening there on the 3080, but I wouldn't use the 6800 XT for ray tracing at 4K. And again, 3080 is showing it's better suited as a 1440p ray tracing GPU in my opinion. Again, some games that are less demanding or older, the 3080 and 6800 XT can max them out at 4K. But again, I think at 4K you're going to be tweaking settings a bit. If you're playing at ultra-wide 1440p, that kind of thing, 3440 by 1440, something like that, you'll be somewhere in between the 1440p and 4K results that we saw here, and I didn't have time to do those ultra-wide benchmarks. Now, how do I think about, how have things changed over time compared to my previous comparisons I've done? Well, one thing I've noticed is that I think AMD has caught up over time in terms of image upscaling, right? If we look at the overall feature set, when these cards launched, the AMD, and the 6800 XT is part of that, did not have FSR. They did not have a DLSS 2 competitor. And while DLSS 2 has evolved and gotten a little bit better image quality over time, much better game support list, FSR launched with a 1.0 version, which honestly at the more aggressive settings was not a great competitor to DLSS because it was a spatial upscaler rather than a temporal upscaler. FSR2, which has now been updated with a 2.1 and even a 2.2 version, and the game support list has been growing rapidly, is a much better DLSS 2 competitor. I've done separate videos on image quality comparisons directly, and I would still give an edge to DLSS, especially at lower resolutions and especially at more aggressive upscaling settings. Going past the quality setting down to balanced or performance, I think the advantage for DLSS becomes more apparent. Using the quality setting at 4K, I think looks great on both of them. So that's what I'm kind of saying there. And there's some pros and cons to both. It's not always an outright win in all cases and tests. But watch my separate video on FSR2 versus DLSS2 if you're interested in that. But I think that's a place where AMD has not caught all the way up, but has gotten extremely close, and it's less of a reason to buy NVIDIA over AMD. Now you might think about, what about DLSS 3? We're talking about the 3080. DLSS 3 does not currently support the 3000 series, and NVIDIA has not stated they ever will support the 3000 series with DLSS 3, whereas AMD has announced FSR 3 and their intentions to do something similar to what DLSS 3 is doing and have broad GPU support. They have said one reason that it's delayed in coming out is that it's difficult to support a wide amount of range of GPUs, which is something they're trying to do. However, that will not be an advantage for the 6800 XT in the future, most likely, because odds are it would also support the 3080. So, that's just kind of, it helps both of them. But anyway, so DLSS 3 doesn't really factor in as an advantage for the 3080 unless at some point that gets ported in. And like I said, no official plans for doing that. The 6800 XT, performance-wise in game, has it aged better? A lot of times we talk about the AMD fine wine. Honestly, while I think the exact selection of games that you benchmark can influence these results, in the past when I've done this, Forza Horizon 5 was a standout win for the 6800 XT because of the smart access memory support and the game's responding well to that. However, NVIDIA has been playing catch up there, and now it looks like the 3080 is basically on par with the 6800 XT. God of War, I saw in the past them basically tied, maybe a small lead for the 3080. That lead is now more pronounced. So overall, I feel like while both GPUs have performed better over time through driver updates, I actually feel like, at least in the set of games I tested here, the 3080 actually pulled a further ahead relative to 6800 XT there. But again, I'm not going to dwell too much on that because I think the exact games you test might matter on that comparison. Now, what about just hardware-wise, which one's better? The 6800 XT's main advantage is the 16 gigabytes of VRAM. That being said, the 12 gigabytes of VRAM did not seem to be causing any problems in any of the tests that I ran here, although people on my channel comment that certain games, especially if you mod them a whole bunch, the extra VRAM can be more of an issue. But in my test suite here, we didn't see 12 gigabytes being a problem. If you were getting the 10 gigabyte version of the card, I think that's more likely to cause problems over time, although keep in mind that if you're gaming at 4K with maxed out settings where that's more likely to be an issue, well, honestly, the 3080 we saw is getting to a point where you'd probably want to turn down settings and or upscale using DLSS, which then reduces the VRAM usage of the game, so might not end up being a problem. Now, in general, we've got comparisons like productivity, all of that. I think AMD has been improving its encoder over time. I think AMD's support in certain productivity applications has improved over time, but I still think it's true that many productivity use cases are still more favorable to NVIDIA. They have a larger market share. So if you're, designing your program, you would probably spend most of your development resources optimizing for the GPU that has larger market share. So if you're using these for professional work cases, I would say look into the particular app that you use and, which one, what is the support like for AMD there? Some apps it's on par, some apps it's significantly less so. Driver issues, things like that. I didn't have any issues with either of them during these benchmarks. In my long-term use of both GPUs over time, had a few problems here and there with both of them. But if you look at the general feeling online about the driver situation, well, that's difficult to quantify. Anyway, now what about the value of the cards though? Because these launch with a very similar MSRP. Well, if you tried to buy them right now, the 3080, the new prices, let's pop over to PC Part Picker looking at new prices. Looks like you'll be spending $900 or more if you want to buy one of these new. For a while, you could get them close to MSRP, around $700. That's no longer the case. It looks like the supply of at least the good priced ones has dried up on these. Whereas if we look at the 6800 XT, they're only costing a mid $500 range. Sometimes those prices sell out, but you know what? I actually recently posted on my community page. I like to post good computer part deals that I find on my community page. If you weren't aware of that, hey, I do that. Anyway, I saw one as low as $520 2 days ago as of the time of filming this. So, the new prices right now on the 6800 XT are significantly better value. So if you're comparing value, price new, buying right now, 6800 XT absolutely destroys the 3080. I think the 3080, like I said, is performing better. You might want to pay more for it, but I don't think $570 versus $900 makes any sense at all. In fact, the 3080 at $900 doesn't make any sense because you can buy a 4070 Ti, which is better, draws less power, still gives you all the NVIDIA advantages plus DLSS 3 for $800 brand new. So just don't pay this amount of money for a brand new 3080. And by the way, I'm not saying the 4070 Ti is necessarily the GPU you should buy. I'm just saying if you're buying NVIDIA, they offer a better, newer GPU for less money currently. So these don't make any sense. So if you're going to buy a 3080, I think the only thing that makes sense is looking at the used market. A quick survey of eBay right now, and at the time you're watching this video, this could all change, is showing me, if I search for, what I'm looking at here is buy it now pricing, and I'm looking at, basically, I sorted out the condition to not include the broken ones, okay? So that doesn't mean these are all in great condition, but it's at least shouldn't be the broken ones. We're seeing them maybe as low as $500, more typically in the mid $500 range, and then going up from there, which means the used pricing of a 3080 is actually very similar to what we're seeing for the brand new pricing of a 6800 XT. So that's kind of an interesting stat. Now, another thing I'll say, though, is looking at the used prices of the 6800 XT under these same conditions, they're generally lower than the 3080s, but not by as much as I think they should be, and not even that low compared to the brand new pricing. So I've got to say that on the used market, they are closer together, to better line up with their actual performance. But I would also say that that means that unless you're finding a great deal, it probably would make a lot of sense to buy a new 6800 XT if the used prices aren't much better than the new pricing. And I would hope to see the used pricing adjust down based on the new pricing. Anyway, hopefully this video was interesting for you guys. Are you interested in me doing any other follow-ups to GPUs I've already compared in the past, but updated on newer titles with the Unreal Engine 5, that sort of thing, you know, see how they perform now on the newest drivers and games, that kind of thing. Anyway, I hope all of you have an excellent day.